Today we're taking a look at the least expensive all-wheel drive SUV in America for 2024. It's the recently refreshed Kia Seltos. Now at this point in time, we don't know what the pricing on the 2024 Mazda CX-30 will be, but in 2023, it was the least expensive all-wheel drive SUV in America. And very much like the Kia Seltos, the Mazda has kind of a dual mission going on, to be the most affordable all-wheel drive SUV in America, but also to be one of the most premium options, and that certainly applies to this SX trim 2024 Seltos we're taking a look at today. Now you might be wondering, how much less expensive is it than the competition? Well, versus a 2024 Subaru Crosstrek, this is $600 less. Versus a 2024 Chevy Trailblazer, this is $2,000 less than one of those all-wheel drive Chevys. So that makes me wonder, can the Seltos actually be affordable and premium at the same time? Does this really work? If you see anything that looks like smoke blowing across the frame in this video, I apologize in advance. It is the middle of August and it's a 50-degree foggy day, as can often happen here in coastal California, and that's why I'm wearing a jacket. For this model year, Kia did more than just slap a new nose on the Seltos. They also reworked the engine and transmission lineup based on customer feedback and gave us a more tech-focused interior. But perhaps the biggest change is in the production capacity. They're going to be building double the number of Seltos vehicles for the North American market. They were pretty hard to come by in 2022 and 2023. That should definitely improve for the 2024 model year. As far as the design goes, it definitely is crisp and modern, definitely upright and boxy also. I like the texturing that Kia has put on these grille elements and the trim elements on either side of the grille itself. We have the modern Kia logo right there, but interestingly, one thing you won't find until you get to the top-end SX trim are these LED headlights and these LED fog lights. I wanted Kia to send me a lower-end trim, perhaps an LX or an S, but instead I ended up with an SX trim, and this is the only model with the LED headlights. If you get the base trim, the LX all-wheel drive, the least expensive model for 2024, is going to have halogen headlights. It's not going to have these accent strips that run into the grille. It's not going to have fog lights below. But interestingly, S, X-Line, and EX will have the light bar and the LED accent. They just won't have the LED headlights. They'll be projector halogens. At the end of this video, I will take a deep dive into pricing, but right now there is something you should know about the Seltos. There are effectively two different base trims. All-wheel drive is standard on the Seltos, but not every trim of Seltos has all-wheel drive, and that is very unusual in the US market. The base trim, which is the LX, is $25,715 including destination. That gives you standard all-wheel drive. The next trim level up is the S trim for $26,315. That does not get you all-wheel drive. That's front-wheel drive. All-wheel drive is optional. In effect, what Kia is doing is allowing you to choose. Do you want all-wheel drive or do you want more features? So in the S trim, all-wheel drive goes away, but you get more color options. You get the roof rails, pretty similar to what we see on this model, the dual LCD layout in the center. You get the LED accent lights on the front bumper that you see on this model, automatic climate control, keyless start, the center armrest, the leather steering wheel, the leather shifter, blind spot monitoring, cross traffic detection, fog lights, and turn signals in the side view mirrors. So actually that S trim appears much closer to this SX than the base LX trim. Then if you want to add all-wheel drive, that's about $2,000 on that S trim. So that is decently more expensive than the base LX model, and that gives you, the shopper, a choice. Do you want the doodads or do you want all-wheel drive? As far as value goes, the base LX trim is a pretty decent deal. But again, I'll go into that later in the video. Just keep that in mind as we're looking around the vehicle. If you're looking at the base model, it's not going to have everything you see here. But if you want the base S trim, then it's actually going to be fairly close to this. Let's take a closer look at the detail work on the front end, something that Kia has been doing a really good job at lately. You'll notice this chrome strip that wraps all the way around the front isn't knurled the entire way. It's knurled up front, and then it actually goes to a smooth strip wrapping around the side. We then have some architectural detail inside the headlight module and this multi-tiered, multi-line amber turn signal array. It gives it a really 3D look. The lower LED bar is actually about 2 inches in front of that top-end LED bar. The The boxy proportions are really obvious when you look at the Seltos from this angle. It reminds me a bit of the Volvo XC40. Definitely a good thing to be reminded of when we're talking about a Kia that is this inexpensive. At 172.6 inches in total length, this is almost exactly the size of a CX-30, a Bronco Sport, or a Compass. It's a little bit smaller than an HR-V Corolla Cross or Crosstrek, but oddly enough, the Honda, Toyota, and Subaru are not necessarily larger on the inside. This has significantly more legroom than we find in the Corolla Cross and a much bigger cargo area than we find in the Subaru Crosstrek. We don't have quite as much ground clearance as you'll find in the more off-roady options like the Bronco Sport and the Subaru though. 7.3 inches, which is decent, but it's not the 8.5 to nearly 9 inches that you'll find in some of those options. On the other hand, that does make loading cargo on the roof a little bit easier. So if you like putting a bicycle or a kayak or something on the roof, we do have standard roof rails in most trims, then it's going to be easier here than in something like the Bronco Sport, which definitely is taller as far as its body and also higher off the ground, really raising that roof line up. Some of the design themes from the front carry over to the back, like this LED light pipe on either side of the Kia logo connecting the two taillight modules. The taillights are somewhat reminiscent of the front headlamp shape as well, although these three stripes here are not the turn signal, that's the amber portion that's flashing on that side. You'll find the backup lights down here at the bottom of the bumper. You will also find a lot of shiny black plastic back here, and I do worry how easily that is going to get scratched. Now, in case you're wondering about this badge, it is not the trim level. This is simply telling people that this has the all-wheel drive system. Under the hood, we find the same base engine as last year. It's a 2-liter naturally aspirated 4-cylinder, producing 146 horsepower, 132 pound-feet of torque. Pretty similar power outputs to the Honda HR-V and the base engine in the Subaru Crosstrek. It's mated to a continuously variable transmission by default, and you'll get 29 miles per gallon if you get the all-wheel drive model, 31 if you get the front-wheel drive model. Again, the next two trims in the lineup up from the base model are going to be front-wheel drive by default, all-wheel drive optional. If you want more oomph, there is the 1.6-liter turbo. You'll find that in the top two trims, and this bumps power up to 195 horsepower, 195 pound-feet of torque. In a big change from last year, we have an 8-speed automatic transmission, not a dual clutch transmission under this hood. And Kia says that was based on customer feedback. Not everybody liked the feel of a dual clutch automatic transmission because they can be a little bit rough around the edges in slow and go traffic. On the other hand, they are efficient, and that's why this doesn't really get an efficiency improvement for 2024. 26 miles per gallon if you get the 1.6-liter turbo. Also interesting, I'll talk about this more in the drive section, even though this has more power, the 8-speed automatic transmission is less efficient, so it actually goes 0 to 60 in the same time as the old dual clutch. At this point in time, Kia has one of the most extensive lineups of boxy vehicles to choose from and a ton of different electrified options as well. So we should roll through those so you understand where the Seltos fits in the lineup. The Soul is the least expensive boxy thing, $19,890. On the inside, it's about the same size as the Seltos, but it's not quite as premium and it can't have all-wheel drive. And that's part of why it's about $5,000 less expensive than this. Price tag wise, we then have the Seltos, which we've seen in this video. Then we have the Sportage for $26,290 starting. The Sportage can have a regular engine, or it can have a hybrid, or it can have a plug-in hybrid. Price tag wise, the next one up from there is the Nero, which is hybrid or EV only. Hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and EV. Size wise, it slots between the Seltos and the Sportage, so a little bit roomier than this on the inside, and of course, at least 50 miles per gallon in the hybrid model. Next up from there, we have the first 3-row option. That would be the Sorento, $30,090. And the Sorento can, yet again, have a regular gasoline drivetrain, a hybrid, or a plug-in hybrid drivetrain. Then we have the Big Daddy Telluride, starting at $35,990 plus destination. So Kia has about 6 or 7 boxy options, depending on exactly how you want to count the various things in their lineup, between about $20,000 and $36,000 before we even start talking about options like the EV6 and the upcoming EV9. If you prefer a more upright driving position, you're probably going to prefer the Seltos over the Crosstrek and possibly over the CX-30. This is definitely more upright than the Crosstrek, a little bit more upright than the Mazda as well, thanks to the boxy proportions and the relatively high roofline. Even though this has the optional moonroof, I still have quite a lot of headroom left. I have about 2.5 inches or so with the seat all the way down, which means if I wanted to, I could have an even more elevated driving position than I'm in right now. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, 2-way adjustable lumbar support for the driver's seat, but you should know that the passenger seat, even in this top-end trim, is not powered at all. It's a completely manual design. With the Seltos, Kia is not aiming quite as high as Mazda is with the CX-30 in terms of its positioning. So we don't find things like the heads-up display, memory seats, things like that that you will find in certain inexpensive Mazda models. And that's perhaps because Kia has so many vehicles in their lineup to choose from. If you want a more premium interior, there is of course the Sportage or the Nero, and there are also decent things in the Soul that are quite nice. Now let's check out the back seat. The front seat's comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I have plenty of legroom back here, about 3, maybe 3.5 inches or so. This is obviously not as wide as the next vehicle up in Kia's lineup, which is why as I start scooting over to the right side, you'll notice that legroom becomes a little bit more limited. Over here, I have about 3/4 of an inch left behind this front passenger seat, slid all the way back. Now there is something to know. As we see in a lot of Hyundai and Kia vehicles, the Seltos has a front seat track that moves really far rearward. This vehicle is a good example of why you should always look at legroom together, front plus second row, rather than each one in a vacuum, because the front seats move forward and backward, and that's going to affect the rear seat numbers. These seat tracks are really long. They move much further rearward than average. So if you have long legs, this is going to be more comfortable for you than a number of the competition, but obviously with the seat all the way back, it's going to make the Seltos look a little smaller. So keep that in mind if you're cross-shopping this against the competition. We have 4 inches more legroom between the firewall and the seat back here than you'll find in the Toyota Corolla Cross, and only about 1/10 or 2/10 less than the Crosstrek or the HR-V. And then of course, remember, we have more cargo area in the back. In the center console, we find large air vents for the rear seat passengers, 2 USB charge ports, and a storage area. And rear seat passengers also get a fold down center armrest and a bit of recline functionality. It's a 2-stage recline, basically upright like the position that I'm in here, and then we get about 1 inch of recline back there like that. In either position, headroom is definitely generous back here, even with the moonroof. In this position, I have about 2 inches of headroom left. And if I move this back forward, that drops down to maybe about 1.5 inches. Behind the optional power hatch, we find 26.6 cubic feet of storage capacity. That's about 30% more than you'll find in the Subaru Crosstrek. Remember that the Crosstrek is essentially a lifted Impreza, and that's why it has more of a passenger car style to its body. It's definitely not as tall from the floorboards all the way up to the ceiling. We also have a very vertical hatch back here in the Seltos that really helps improve cargo practicality. If the load floor is at its lowest stage, you could definitely line up a lot of bags back here, but you would have to remove this hard cargo cover. They will fit here with the power hatch closed, but not if this rigid cargo cover is still in place. And that's how we were able to squeeze 5 bags back here in our 24-inch roller bag test. The floor of the cargo area has a 2-stage function. In this lower level, you can see it's level with the top of that temporary spare tire. You could stuff some things right there around the spare tire. And if I put it in its upper position, it is then level with the cargo area opening, and you can see there's a lot of additional storage space there. You could even put a full-size spare tire in here yourself aftermarket if you wanted to, and it would fit under there. Also, a nice touch that fits under there is the hard cargo cover. That will just go right there, and then you can put those bigger bags on top. The 60/40 folding rear seats offer a little bit of recline functionality. You can see the one on the right is in its most upright position, the one on the left is in its most reclined position, and obviously that will impact the cargo area. But rather thankfully, the center shoulder belt does not come out of the ceiling or the side of the vehicle like it does in the Crosstrek, so it doesn't impact your cargo carrying capacity at all. As we look around the interior, keep in mind we are in the top-end SX trim, but most of the Seltos you'll find on dealer lots will have this 2-screen infotainment setup. We'll get to that in just a moment though. First, let's take a look up here. We have the controls for the optional moonroof. It's a pretty standard-sized moonroof opening right there. We also have sliding sun visors, which is a nice touch. Driver and front passenger get height-adjustable shoulder belts and 2-way adjustable headrests. This model has the optional leather upholstery, and that leather upholstery is perforated because these seats are both heated and ventilated, something that you don't find in most of the competition. We have moderately aggressive bolstering on the seat back and bottom cushions, but I don't think larger folks should have too much of a problem in here. It's probably difficult to tell on camera, but the seats and the armrest here are a really dark olive green that contrasts with the dark charcoal doors. You can get a variety of different interior color options. This one is the most intriguing, although I think I would select one of the lighter interior colors. We have a decent amount of hard plastic here, as you'd expect. Hard plastics on the bottom, hard plastics on the upper section of the door, but soft touch plastics in this mid-zone. As we see in so many new vehicles, there's a reasonable amount of shiny black plastic going on in here. For instance, right there around that really slim door handle. Those plastics are likely going to get scratched a little bit more easily than the plastics around those window switches. Taking a look a little bit forward on that door, you'll also notice we have that very angular speaker grille right there. That's the tweeter grille, and that is meant to coordinate with this really angular Bose speaker grille down there at the bottom of the door, right around that really big storage area at the bottom of the door. Let me know what you think about this design. I have to admit, it reminds me of a car I used to own that had metal speaker grates, and they got dented after I had the car for about 5 years or so. It just didn't look quite as fresh as it did when it was new, and that's really what that reminds me of. Moving over to the dashboard, we find harder plastics up top, softer plastics in the middle with this faux stitching, harder plastics below, just as you'd expect, and then we find a bin-style glove compartment that I was not able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside, although smaller ones might fit. It's a little bit difficult to show on camera, but there's also an ambient lighting strip that runs just under that green section of the dashboard. The twin-screen dashboard is definitely a defining feature of this interior. Each of these LCDs is just over 10 inches in size. This central one gives us Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, of course, your typical media and navigation functionality, and then we have a non-touchscreen display over here on the driver's side for the instrument cluster. Now, a lot of folks have been asking me about glare on modern LCDs without a binnacle or a cover over them. It's not really a problem in strong sunlight. You can obviously get a little bit of glare, but you could get glare on any plastic surface. But the reason it doesn't cause a visibility problem is because the LCD inside is close bonded to the plastic on the surface, and that didn't used to be the case. There actually used to be a bit of an air layer or gap in there, and that really not only makes the screen look brighter and sharper, and you can really see from these angles, you don't get that weird little gap that you used to get in screens. It also means much reduced glare in strong sunlight. Now again, obviously if sun is hitting this black surface right here directly, it's going to glare into your eyes, but that would be the same with a cover or without. As we see in other Kia models with the widescreen format infotainment system, you do have to plug in your smartphone, so no wireless connectivity is offered here. Let's go back to the Kia native screen. This is basically the same software that you find in the wider format of LCDs. So say Telluride, Sportage, etc. This is essentially the same software. One cool touch in here though is we have the sound mood lamp, kind of borrowed from the Kia Soul. This basically controls the ambient lighting in the vehicle, and you can have the ambient lighting in the vehicle beat along with your music. So you would do that by turning on the mood lamp, obviously with the on-off right there, and then you scroll down here and you choose Music Plus, and then you change the brightness level. And that will cause the ambient lighting strip, let's see if you can actually see it right there. It's actually illuminating right there between those two sections. It's a little bit difficult to see. It will cause that to pulsate with your music. I would love to show you, but for copyright reasons, obviously I can't be pumping music in this video. Below that LCD, we have two big air vents. The engine start-stop button, that's a feature you'll find on most trims as well, but not the base model. Single zone automatic climate control, again, most trims, but not the base model. Lots of physical buttons down here, so they did not replace the button rack with that touch button setup we see in other Kias. Going down from there, we find a Qi wireless charging slot where you can stick your smartphone, and then we have the USB cables. It's a little bit difficult to see, but they're right there just under the Qi wireless charging mat. There's a regular USB port and a USB-C port. The USB-C is charge only, and then there's a 12-volt power port next to them. In the middle of everything, we have a pretty traditional console shifter. This is the drive mode selector knob. You rotate it around for the various drive modes. We then have controls for the heated seats and ventilated seats up front. Parking camera right over there. This little lock button tells the all-wheel drive system to send more power to the rear. It will not command a full lock, so don't worry about that. You can use it on regular paved surfaces. We then have a button for hill descent control. Back from there, we find two pretty decently sized cup holders. I was certainly able to accommodate some of those larger takeout drinks there. Auto brake hold, electric parking brake, and a small storage cubby. The center console does change a little bit from the base model on up to the upper end trim. You'll see that two-tone interior going on there again in this SX model. Softly padded, opens to reveal a pretty decent sized storage compartment, although not quite large enough to put a gallon of milk inside. It is really, really close. If you're wondering what the key looks like, here it is. You can see it has the lock button right there, angled on the end like we see in so many Kia keys. Lock, unlock, and panic there, and then the remote start button right there on the side. Going back to the instrument cluster for just a second, there are 4 different themes you can choose from. You can link them to the drive mode, or you can unlink them, your choice. We have Classic A, Classic B, Classic C, and dynamic. Dynamic is probably the coolest. It gives us sort of a moving horizon, and it does change based on the time of day. However, it's not like it's a scene of the city you're coming up to. It's not quite that intelligent, so who knows what city that is. It's nothing to do with the Bay Area, of course. And you also won't get a moving map display up here, although you can get turn-by-turn navigation directions if you use the factory navigation in the car. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design with the flat bottom, nicely aggressive grips on the side. On the left side, we find controls for the infotainment system, so volume up, down, track forward, backward, mode switch, and voice command button. And then over here on the right side, we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control system, Kia's aggressive lane centering software, that's that button right there. And then these toggles and this button control that multifunction LCD cluster. One last thing before we get this vehicle out on the road. You'll notice that over here on the driver's side, we have kind of an unusual cut line in the dashboard plastic. That appears to be because in some markets you can get this with a heads-up display. Rather unfortunately, in the US you cannot. And instead of giving us a different dashboard stamping, Kia actually just recycles the same one and then gives us this blank panel right in the middle. That's something I really wish they would change, because for some reason that bugged me an awful lot more during my week with this vehicle than it did when I first drove this at the launch event. Depending on the position of the steering wheel, it may not be too obvious for you. This is basically my driving position right here, but if I sit in a more upright position, then you're really just kind of staring at that as you're also staring out at the road. Before we get this out on the road, we should talk wheels and tires. 17-inch wheels are standard, wrapped in 215 width tires. If you get the 1.6-liter turbo, then it bumps up to this tire right here, which is a 235/45 R18. Curb weights range from 2,936 pounds up to 3,362 pounds, meaning that the Seltos is a little bit heavier than something like the Honda HR-V. Now it's time to get the Seltos out on the road. In our 0 to 60 testing, it took this model 7 seconds to accomplish that task. That is, interestingly, exactly the same as the last Seltos we tested with the dual clutch transmission, even though this vehicle has 20 horsepower more and a slightly different torque curve as well. The main reason for that is the automatic transmission. Dual clutch transmissions are really efficient, and that dual clutch transmission had a very aggressive first gear. You will really notice that. You will also notice with this automatic transmission a little bit more turbo lag perhaps than with the DCT, especially if I take it to a complete stop and floor it. Right around 15 miles an hour is when that turbo is really on the boil, and then we get a lot more acceleration than that first 15 miles an hour or so. If you get the regular 2-liter engine, then not much has changed. They've tweaked some of the programming with the continuously variable transmission. Other than that, the power output, the fuel economy, and the way they behave are identical to the last model I drove. One thing to note about Kia's CVT is, unlike a Nissan CVT and more like a Honda CVT, they shift faster. So if you're just cruising along like this and you floor it, it's going to have what feels more like a traditional automatic transmission shift. It's going to get to that lower ratio faster, and it's going to make it feel more engaging to drive, even on road surfaces like this. Fun roads, obviously. In my 60 to 0 stopping distance, it took 111 feet for this model to stop from 60 to 0. That stretches out to 118 feet if you get the base model with the skinnier tires. I was able to do a very brief amount of testing with a dealer-provided model. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to film that one, but I was able to get a few test scores out of that model. When it comes to handling, there are a few nuances to consider. Obviously, the less expensive models are going to have skinnier tires, but also, if you get the front-wheel drive model, it doesn't have an independent rear suspension. So most of the Seltos will have an independent rear, but there are going to be 2 trims where the independent rear suspension is effectively optional. So in the S trim and the EX trim, then you get a torsion beam suspension in the back in the base version. Optional all-wheel drive brings with it an upgraded suspension in the rear. You will notice the difference if you start to push the models hard out on your favorite winding mountain road, but it's actually going to be easier to push the all-wheel drive model as hard as you would need to in order to notice the difference, so I don't suspect that it's too big of a deal. And in that respect, the front-wheel drive models are actually a little bit more similar to what we see in the Mazda CX-30 because that does not have a fully independent rear suspension. The suspension in this vehicle is a little bit softer than what we find in the CX-30, very comparable to the HR-V, the Corolla Cross, and a little bit firmer than what we find in the Subaru Crosstrek. So this definitely stays a little bit more level in the corners than the Crosstrek. There's less tip and dive if I push on the brake pedal, or if I floor it. You'll notice the front end doesn't kick up quite as much as the Subaru. Speaking of the Subaru, that is the best seller in the segment, so I could see a lot of folks cross-shopping this with that. This is going to be more engaging, especially because we get that turbocharged engine, we get a traditional automatic transmission, we get a slightly lower center of gravity in this vehicle, and it's a little less off-road focused. The Crosstrek, logically based on its audience, tends to be a little bit more focused on some of those off-road tasks, so it's going to be more comfortable on longer distance trails, things like that. This is going to be better at carving the corners. The slightly softer suspension and the independent rear suspension are obvious on a rougher gravel road like I'm on here. This is certainly a bit more comfortable on these road surfaces than the Mazda CX-30, and you'll notice if you start pushing the Seltos harder, two things will happen. A, it will start sending more power to the rear, especially if I have that lock mode engaged. Again, not a full lock, but it is telling it to send more power to the back. And also, the rear suspension does not become as upset over broken pavement as the CX-30. That is the one flaw I found with that Mazda model. It is absolutely fantastic on the road, but the moment the road surface is less than perfect, that lack of an independent rear suspension really starts hampering the CX-30's performance. When it comes to the ride quality score, I'm going to give this model an A. I think Kia found exactly the right balance for this segment. Handling is a little bit above some of the major players thanks to the wider tires and the general design of the Seltos, but they didn't make it as extra firm as the CX-30 often feels, meaning that I think this is more appropriate for people that do longer commutes or longer highway drives, or simply want something that's a little bit more comfortable, a little bit easier to live with. Cabin noise is pretty comparable to most of the competition. I'm going to go ahead and give this an A-. We measured 72 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, meaning it's approximately the equal of the HRV, the Crosstrek, etc. This does come across as a little bit quieter than certain versions of the Bronco Sport, depending on the trim level and the tires that you get. As I said at the beginning of the video, Kia swapped out the dual clutch transmission for a traditional automatic transmission with the turbo engine based on customer feedback and, of course, feedback from reviewers like me. Although I like DCTs, so personally I never minded it. The dual side effect of this is, again, more power required to go the same 0 to 60 and slightly lower fuel economy. Over a week of mixed driving, this vehicle up and averaging 24 miles per gallon. That's not fantastic. Remember that I do go up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass, so obviously that's going to damp things down. Also, this is a decent amount of fun, so that also is going to drop my fuel economy a bit versus some of the more boring options. But any way you slice it, this is likely going to be less efficient than the 2022 or 2023 Seltos with the dual clutch transmission. I think that's a bit of a bummer, but for most folks, this automatic transmission probably is a better fit. It's going to feel better in stop and go and slow and go traffic. It's not going to have engagements that are quite as harsh as a dual clutch can sometimes have. But on the other hand, it's not going to shift as quickly. It's not going to give you that direct feeling like a DCT can give you. And then, of course, the acceleration and fuel economy differences there as well. Before we get to pricing, I want to circle back to turbo lag because you will notice it more in this than in the Mazda, although all turbocharged engines will have at least a little bit of lag. That's likely because of the displacement of the engine and also the general turbocharger design. 1.6 liters versus 2.5 over there in the Mazda. It's a pretty big difference. If I slow down here to say 28 miles an hour, let the transmission shift up, there we go, so we're only going at 1,200 RPM and I floor it, now we get full power out of the engine. So you are going to feel that spool up more in this than in the Mazda. Although, again, interestingly, the Mazda is not necessarily going to give you better fuel economy, and it's only going to be a little bit faster 0 to 60 than this. And depending on your passing maneuvers actually could be pretty close, because this has more gears to choose from, so it could find a better gear ratio lower than the 6-speed auto could find in the Mazda. Of course, the Mazda has over 300 pound-feet of torque, so that really helps things out there. Let's dive even deeper into pricing. Again, the base model starts at $25,715. For about $600 more, you could get the S front-wheel drive trim. And here's what the trade-off involves. Let me just read through this list of features that you get in the S trim. You get blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic detection, the push button start, the smart key access where you just grab the handle and it unlocks, heated side view mirrors with the turn signal repeaters, automatic climate control, stain-resistant cloth seats, leather steering wheel, leather gear shifter, LED interior lights, otherwise they're regular incandescent bulbs. You also get the twin 10.25-inch LCD setup in the dashboard. If you don't get the S trim, you get an 8-inch LCD and a smaller 4-inch LCD in the middle. You get XM radio, remote start, the Kia connected app functionality, roof rails, fog lights, LED tail lights, LED DRLs, but not LED headlights. We'll talk about that more in a bit. The chrome bits on the grille and on the side of the vehicle. And you get some extra colors. If you get the base trim, you're limited to just 4 colors, and some of them will cost you a little extra. If you get the S trim, you have the choice of 9 different color combinations, including some 2-tone color schemes. But there is a little bit more of a trade-off rather than just losing all-wheel drive. You also lose the independent rear suspension, and the brakes actually get just a little bit smaller. So you have to decide, do you want all-wheel drive? Do you want the extra features? And are you willing to give up just a few features here, all-wheel drive, slightly bigger brakes, and the independent rear suspension? The non-independent rear suspension is not bad. It's going to feel an awful lot like certain versions of the Kia Soul have felt generation over generation, and it's worth noting that the Mazda CX-30, for instance, in this segment, does not offer an independent rear suspension in any version at all. If you want all-wheel drive and you want those bells and whistles, you're going to have to add all-wheel drive to the S trim, and that's going to get you up to $27,815. If you're interested in features like a power driver's seat, leatherette upholstery, it's worth noting that real leather is not available in any Seltos trim, and heated front seats, then you have to step up to the EX trim. I'll let you refer to the pricing on this chart. If you want the turbo engine, it's going to be standard in the X-Line trim and the SX only. In those models, all-wheel drive is also standard. And interesting twist, if you want some features that are going to be found in baseline trims of the competition, you have to work all the way up to the SX trim, most notably adaptive cruise control. That's going to be found only in the SX trim, LED headlights only in the SX trim. Ventilated seats are something that you don't find in most of the competition, but those are going to only be in the SX trim as well. Kia has decided to make the SX trim in a decent number of their vehicles basically everything in the kitchen sink trim. So fully loaded, all the gadgets and doodads that you want, ventilated seats, the panoramic moonroof, things like that, those are going to be either standard or available in the SX trim. And in some of their vehicles, those features may not be offered in other trim levels. If you get carried away and you get a fully loaded SX trim, you'll end up right around $33,000, just under. It's worth noting that is less expensive than a lot of the competition. And part of the way Kia gets there is by giving these limits as far as the number of features and the number of options that you have. By bundling everything together in one trim, they've streamlined the inventory and they've made things a little bit less expensive. Let's roll through the final scores. Obviously, I think styling is an asset for the Seltos, both inside and outside. And if you were worried about glare on those large 10.25-inch LCD screens, they don't really suffer from much sunlight glare because they now have a close bonded LCD. So the LCD image is very close to the surface and directly bonded to the plastic that's on the outside. That really reduces the kind of glare that LCDs used to have in the 90s and early 2000s. Obviously, we have the value pricing, both value in every trim and the base value of having that standard all-wheel drive system. I know rear seat air vents are near and dear to a lot of your hearts. The Seltos does have them, interestingly, in every trim, and for some reason that's something that is missing in every version of, say, the 2024 Subaru Crosstrek. I was actually pretty surprised about that. One other thing that's surprising, still no wireless CarPlay or Android Auto. I know some people really love that feature. Personally, I always plug my phone in, even if wireless is offered, so it's not a big deal to me. A little bit more of a deal is that you can only get the turbo in the top trims, the top 2 trims, the LED headlights only in the absolute top trim, and adaptive cruise control only in that top trim as well. And as we roll through some of the competitive pricing here, you'll notice that some of these features are standard in every trim level of competition, like the Honda HR-V and, of course, the Toyota Corolla Cross. It's hard to go wrong with any of the mainline entries in the subcompact crossover segment right now. From the Mazda CX-30 to the Bronco Sport to the Jeep Compass, there are reasons you might want to pick each of those options. On the chart in front of you, we have the Seltos, we have the Crosstrek, which is the best seller in this segment, and the HR-V and the Corolla Cross are also top sellers. The Corolla Cross is likely going to be one of the best sellers as soon as Toyota ramps up production, because they also have the only hybrid in this segment at the moment. If you're looking for fantastic fuel economy, the Corolla Cross is the place to go. Also, a decent amount of standard equipment happens even in the front-wheel drive base model, but Obviously, all-wheel drive is going to be a bit more expensive. Adding that makes it a little bit more expensive than the Seltos, but we do have standard features like adaptive cruise control. Honda and Toyota have been really aggressive at putting their latest active safety systems and driver support systems on every trim, including base versions, and that really does pose a really solid value proposition against the Seltos, where some of those features are optional or excluded just to the top trim. Of course, if you're looking at top-end trims, you're going to get better performance and more doodads in the Seltos than most of the competition for a little bit less. You're also going to get Kia's standard long powertrain warranty, 10 years, 100,000 miles. That really gives a lot of folks extra peace of mind, especially when compared against options like the Subaru Crosstrek, which has been the best seller in this segment, but reliability has not always been Subaru's strong suit, especially long-term reliability when it comes to things like oil leaks, etc. The Crosstrek is a solid option because there's lots of standard equipment, lots of standard safety equipment, standard all-wheel drive, etc., lots of ground clearance, and there's also a more off-road focused wilderness trim. That's the top-end $35,000 approximately trim on this chart. You can spend a little bit less and get the top-end versions that are non-wilderness, but they're still going to be a bit more than the Seltos. They are going to have power that's not too far off, but it's not a turbocharged engine, and it's still a CVT. Not everybody out there is a fan of the CVT, and remember that Subaru's latest all-wheel drive systems don't send quite as much power to the rear as some people might like. The Honda HR-V has a really narrow pricing range, a lot of standard equipment. I think it's pretty attractive, but it does come across as maybe a little bit plain, maybe a little bit boring. The Corolla Cross is probably one of my top picks in this segment. The Seltos, the Crosstrek, and the Corolla Cross are probably the three ones that I would recommend the most. The Corolla Cross Hybrid is the reason for that. If you're looking for a small crossover and you really want reliability, you really want high fuel economy, Corolla Cross Hybrid is absolutely the way to go. If you want the snazzier, more tech-focused option with a relatively low price, long warranty, and a nice roomy interior, that is certainly the Seltos. If you're looking for the option that's really hard to go wrong with, that would be the Crosstrek. Most Subaru dealers are not marking up a lot. You may have to order your Crosstrek. Unfortunately, they are pretty limited as far as inventory because it has been selling like absolute hotcakes. On the downside, the interior comes across as a little bit less tech-focused, I would say, than the Seltos. The large screen in the center of the dashboard is really nice, but the instrument cluster feels a little bit last generation, and the infotainment software also feels a little bit behind as far as design. It's also missing some things, like it doesn't have rear seat air vents for some reason. But it's going to be very practical if you do plan on taking your vehicle off-road, if you plan on putting things like canoes or skis or things like that on the roof. That roofline is nice and low. Bottom line for the moment, it's hard to go wrong with the Seltos, just like it's hard to go wrong with the other options, making decisions in this segment very, very tricky. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section. The Seltos is absolutely one of my recommended models. But then again, so are a decent number of its competition. So let me know what you would pick if you're shopping in this segment, especially if you have recently purchased one. What did you get and why? Let me know down there in the comment section below. See all of you next week.